Okay, then. So we are going to be looking at the Prague Spring today. So one of the last events for the Cold War course that we're looking at. So one of the most important developments in the Eastern Satellite States during the Cold War. What I want to do very quickly before we start that, though, is I want you to make sure that in your books or on your notepads, you've got the title, which is the Prague Spring of 1968. And before we get into the background of what the Prague Spring was, we're going to start with a quick quiz. First few questions are going to be about the Cuban Missile Crisis from our last video lecture lesson, and then I'm going to give you a few questions on stuff from further back that is relevant to what we're looking at today. Okay, so see how many of them you can get. Make sure you've got the title down, and then as always, make sure you've got the answers in your exercise books and you can correct them afterwards, okay? But obviously you just need to write out the answers, not the questions. So see how many of them you can remember without going back in your notes. Okay, so question 1. What year was the Cuban Missile Crisis? Number 2, so you've got 2 here. In 1959, Fidel something led the Cuban Revolution in overthrowing the US-backed dictator something. So I want to know what those 2 gaps are. Fidel what led the revolution, overthrowing the US-backed dictator something. What was his name? Right, number 3. The Cuban government requested Soviet missiles following the US-supported invasion at the Bay of what? What's the missing word there? Right, number 4. How were the Soviet missiles in Cuba discovered by the US? So how did the US discover the Soviet missiles in Cuba? Right, number 5. Very briefly, what did Kennedy's government do after discovering the missiles? So what was the Kennedy government's response once they discovered the missiles? Right, number 6. What did the US agree to do in exchange for the Soviets withdrawing their missiles from Cuba? So what did the US agree to do in exchange for the Soviets withdrawing their missiles from Cuba? This is the deal they made at the end of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Right, number 7. What was the name of the Soviet military alliance with its Eastern Satellite States established in 1955? So what was the name of the Soviet military alliance with its Eastern Satellite States established in 1955? It's that one that is their version of NATO. Right, number 8. Which Soviet leader was removed and replaced in 1964, 2 years after the Cuban Missile Crisis? And see if you can spell it right as well. Right, number 9. After World War II, Eastern Europe was seen as part of the Soviets' something of something. I want to know what those 2 words beginning with S and I are. And final question. What word beginning with C describes controlling what the media are able to say or publish? Okay, guys, so hopefully you've had a go at all 10 of those now. So very quickly now, see how many of the answers you managed to get, and then we're going to start the lecture for today. Okay, so 1962 was the year of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Fidel Castro led the Cuban Revolution, and that revolution overthrew the US dictator Batista. So remember to write those down if you didn't get either of those. Right, the Cuban government requested Soviet missiles following the US invasion at the Bay of Pigs. So remember that US-backed invasion of the Cuban exiles who were trained up by the CIA. After they tried to invade Cuba, Castro demanded nuclear missiles from the Soviets as a way of deterring the Americans from trying to do the same thing again. Right, and then on the 14th of October 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis began when a U-2 spy plane spotted the missiles being installed in Cuba. So a U-2 spy plane was how the US discovered the missiles in Cuba. And then we know that Kennedy blockaded or quarantined, you can use either term, he blockaded and quarantined Cuba. So they surrounded it with their Navy and stopped any ships approaching Cuba to stop the Soviets getting any more missiles and equipment to Cuba. The deal that and then ended the Cuban Missile Crisis was the Soviets agreed to withdraw their missiles from Cuba in exchange for the US withdrawing their missiles from Turkey. Okay, so that's the key agreement that ended the crisis. Now, the military alliance that the Soviets had with its eastern satellite states was the Warsaw Pact, very important for today's lesson. So the Warsaw Pact. Khrushchev was replaced in 1964, so he'd been the leader during the Cuban Missile Crisis. He was partly replaced 2 years later because although this deal that led to the Soviets withdrawing their missiles from Turkey was quite a good deal in some ways, the part of the deal that the Americans would withdraw their missiles from Turkey was kept secret from the public. So one of the reasons why Khrushchev was overthrown 2 years later in 1964 was because there was a perception by some people in the regime that he'd made the Soviets look weak with the way that the Cuban Missile Crisis had ended. At the end of World War II, Eastern Europe was seen as part of the Soviets' sphere of influence, so this area where they would have a strong level of influence over the government and how the countries were run. And then finally, keyword censorship. Okay, so when the media have what they are able to say in print controlled by the government. Okay, so censorship was very common within the Soviet satellite states in Eastern Europe. Okay, so on to what we're looking at today then. So the Prague Spring of 1968. Okay, now this is one of the most important topics if we're thinking about the Cold War in the eastern satellite states of the Soviet Union. It's 12 years after the Hungarian uprising of 1956, and it shares a lot of features with the Hungarian uprising in terms of this is a movement to try and change the system of communist government in Czechoslovakia, and ended in similar but slightly different ways to that of Hungary in 1956. Okay, now just first of all, and also before we go on, I've also made a knowledge organizer for this one. So you go and show my homework, that's on there. You might find it useful to either have this up or to print it out, probably even better, just to follow some of the key dates and names as we're going through the lecture. Okay, so that's on there if you want it. Now, first of all, why was this event called the Prague Spring? Okay, now the reason for that is Czechoslovakia, obviously one of the most important eastern satellite states of the Soviet Union, and the capital city is Prague. Okay, so the events we're looking at today, although they were taking place in Czechoslovakia as a whole, they were nicknamed the Prague Spring because they took place in Prague, predominantly in which is the capital of Czechoslovakia. Now, why is it called a spring? Okay, now that's to do with the fact that if you think about what spring means metaphorically, right? The spring is all about the idea that following winter, there's this kind of growth of new life. There's a new beginning. Okay, so following a dark winter, you get this period of like rebirth and regrowth. Okay, now the reason this period was called the Prague Spring was the leaders who led the Prague Spring weren't actually seeking to replace socialism / communism with capitalism. They were seeking a new beginning for socialism and communism in Czechoslovakia. So they were trying to reform it in a new direction to make it genuinely popular with the people. Okay, so the key leader of the Prague Spring, Alexander Dubček, he famously said that in the Prague Spring that they were seeking a new start to socialism. So no, a new start to socialism, not replacing it with capitalism, a new start for it. And he described his political program as socialism with a human face. Okay, so this is an attempt to make socialism in Czechoslovakia more democratic, more popular, and more liberal and free. Okay, so that's why it was nicknamed the Prague Spring. Now, In terms of why people in Czechoslovakia had begun to demand a new beginning for socialism, why they begun turning against the Soviet model of socialism and communism, several reasons. Okay, now the first ones were political factors to do with how the country was actually run. Okay, so politics is about power, who holds power, and how the country is run. So there were political reasons why people in Czechoslovakia wanted a new start, or they were unhappy with the Soviet model they currently had. And the first thing to be reminded of, guys, is that after World War II, we've seen that when the Soviet Union defeat Germany, they obviously have to occupy Eastern Europe on their march to capture Germany. Okay, so we saw at the end of World War II, all of Eastern Europe is occupied by the Soviet Union's armies, and then they become part of its sphere of influence. So we saw at Yalta and Potsdam, it was accepted by the West that these eastern areas would come under strong Soviet influence, and that was agreed between them. Okay. Now, what that meant in the case of Czechoslovakia was that after 1948, first of all, it became a one-party state. Okay. Now, we looked at that at the beginning of the course, but in the sort of Soviet Stalinist model that was pushed onto Czechoslovakia, other political parties were outlawed. So the only political party that was allowed to hold power in Czechoslovakia was the Communist Party. Okay, so it's not like in Britain today where you can vote between different political parties like the Labour Party or the Conservative Party. It became a one-party communist state. Okay, and some people were against that because they obviously wanted to have a choice of political parties in order to be democratic, but they also felt like the Communist Party had too much power because of its monopoly, the fact it was the only party that had any power, and that made it corrupt and various other things. The other big thing was that in the Soviet model imposed on Czechoslovakia, there was obviously a lack of individual freedom. Okay, so there was heavy censorship of the media. So the government had strong say over what was printed in the newspapers, what was produced for television, what was allowed to be said on the radio, and many people had sort of turned against that. Likewise, as well, there was a lot of repression in Czechoslovakia. So just like in Hungary, there was a secret police, political opponents could be arrested, occasionally they were killed. There was also a lot of corruption. Okay, so people with connections to the communist government and the Communist Party tended to be able to get, a better standard of living, basically. So being able to get better access to housing, jobs, better healthcare. So there was a lot of corruption built into the system in Czechoslovakia. And that was particularly embodied by this guy, Novotny, first key name you need to know. So Novotny, who was the communist leader before the Prague Spring in 1968. Kind of similar to Rákosi, if you remember, in Hungary, not as brutal, but very, very corrupt and very unpopular with most ordinary Czechoslovakians. Now, so these are all the political factors then. So it was a one-party state. People thought that gave the Communist Party too much power. Censorship of the media, lots of government corruption, lots of repression, and a very unpopular communist leader at the top of the pyramid of Czechoslovakia in Novotny. Now, there were also economic reasons why the Soviet model in Czechoslovakia was also becoming under pressure and becoming very unpopular. Okay, now, just a quick recap. We looked at the start of the course about some of the differences between a communist and capitalist economy. Okay, now we saw at the start of the course that in a communist society, the economy has industry largely nationalized by the government. Okay, so most of industry and businesses are owned by the government, whereas in a capitalist system, most industries and businesses are privately owned. Okay, now obviously the idea in the communist system was that by having businesses be owned by the government, it would allow profits to be taken for the whole of society and then used to fund things like education and healthcare, etc. Their argument against private ownership was that obviously private ownership leads to inequality. Okay. Another big difference between communist and capitalist economic systems is that in a communist system, the economy was planned. Okay, so the government would plan what would be needed each year. They would then order factories to make that. Okay, in capitalist societies, there was a free market. Okay, so what was produced by companies would depend on what people wanted to buy individually. Okay, so there was a big difference in how the economy was organized. Okay, now you don't need to know all of this stuff in detail, but without getting into the details too much, some people argue that this model of having a nationalized economy that was centrally planned had led to lots of inefficiencies. Okay, So as a result, Czechoslovakia had a lower standard of living than equivalent Western societies at the same time. Some people thought that that meant that parts of the Soviet model would have to be changed and updated to try and improve the standard of living in the country to make the economy grow. But as well as having lower standard of living in Western countries, workers in Czechoslovakia actually also had a lack of power. So obviously the ideal of like a communist society was that, you know, working class people were meant to be the rulers and meant to have power. But in practice in Czechoslovakia, the government had most of the power and working people had very little, okay? Trade unions especially, which are obviously the organizations that represent workers, were not free in Czechoslovakia. So the trade unions were controlled by the government, and their ability to go on strike was quite limited as a result. So on those two levels, the level of the standard of living that people had access to and the actual power that workers had, they were both very low. So that meant that lots of people who didn't necessarily even want Czechoslovakia to become capitalist recognized that there were things about their model that had to be changed. Now, the sort of first roots of the Prague Spring that you really have to know is that there is an economist, Otto Sick, who began demanding reforms in 1966, so a couple of years before the Prague Spring begins. Now, Otto Sick's quite an interesting guy, actually, because he was a member of the Communist Party. He'd actually been in a concentration camp with Novotny, the leader of the Communist Party in Czechoslovakia. So they'd both been members of the Communist Party when Germany had invaded Czechoslovakia at the start of World War II. Because they were communists, they were put into concentration camps. He also knew Alexander Dubček's father from his time in that. So he wasn't anti-communist. He just believed that there was a better economic model that could be, you know, used to improve these things, to improve the standard of living for Czech people and to give ordinary working people more power. Okay. So in 1966, he made a series of demands. Okay. Now, he pointed out, first of all, that Czechoslovakia had the lowest economic growth rates in the whole of the Eastern Bloc. So even compared to other communist satellite states like Hungary or Poland, Czechoslovakia had particularly poor economic growth before you even began comparing it with the Western societies. So he recommended a few things to try and improve the Czech economy. Okay. Now, the first thing that he demanded was this idea of a mixed economy. Okay. So he said, instead of having all of industry being nationalized and run by the government or having it all privately owned, what he wanted was to have a mixed economy. So some industries would remain under the control of the government being nationalized, other ones would be allowed to be privatized and be privately run. And likewise, to create a balance between government planning of the economy, but also allowing some free markets to decide what goods were produced, okay? And he also said, as well as having some industries and businesses privately owned, he called for workers to be given more power. So he called for free trade unions, and he also called for more rights for consumers. So if people bought products that were of a very poor quality or were dangerous, they would have the right to, you know, challenge the government and get refunds and demand better quality products. Okay, so he recommended these changes to try and improve the economy in Czechoslovakia. Now, all of those reforms, though, were rejected by the Communist Party at the time. And as a result, what Sick came to demand was not just economic reform, but also political reform. So he said that in order for his economic reforms to be carried out, he now recognized that that was inseparable from political reform. And the reason he said that was that he said that, well, the reason why the government aren't taking my advice to carry out these economic reforms is because they're scared of losing control and power over the economy. So in a system where working people have very little power, where there's a one-party state and no democracy, it's actually very hard to get the government to shift policy, okay? So he came to recognize that actually, before any economic reform would have to happen, the way the country would run would have to fundamentally change, okay? So he demanded political reform. Now, his demands became very popular. So over 1967, you have these growing protest movements in Czechoslovakia, up until the point of actually having, you know, street demonstrations, which resulted in clashes with the police and the army. And in 1968, at the very beginning in January, the Soviets decide, right, we've got to control the situation. This is getting a bit out of hand. So to try and calm the situation, the Soviets forced Novotny, the unpopular communist leader of Czechoslovakia, to resign. Okay, so they recognized that his corruption and his repression had made him very unpopular. So to try and improve the situation, they allow a reforming communist leader, Alexander Dubček, come to power. Okay, so again, if you remember back to the Hungarian uprising, this is very similar to what happened then. Okay, so you had Rákosi, the very repressive communist dictator, and Khrushchev allowed Imre Nagy, as some of you like to say, come to power as a way of trying to get the protests back on side. Okay, so Dubček replaces Novotny as the communist leader of Czechoslovakia and begins to carry out reforms. Okay, and again, he says that he is aiming for socialism with a human face. Okay, now what did he mean by socialism with a human face? Okay. So when Dubček comes to power, he starts carrying out these reforms. Now, some of the first things he does is that he removes some state control over the economy. So following some of the advice that Otto Sick did. So some small businesses were allowed to be run privately. So, for example, taxis were privatized, and small cafes and restaurants. The attitude was, why should these be things that are run by the government? They can be run better, actually, in small private hands. So they removed some state controls of the economy. They also allow free trade unions. So trade unions are no longer controlled by the government. They're allowed, working class people are allowed to freely organize using these free trade unions. Likewise as well, so those are the economic reforms. Political reforms as well, so censorship of the media was removed. Okay, so the government's control over the television, the radio, the newspaper press was removed, so people were able to openly criticize the government without fear of arrest anymore. So political criticism was allowed and encouraged as part of this process of renewing socialism in Czechoslovakia. So there's a lot more freedom in the media and the press. But what Dubček was very careful to do was the promise that Czechoslovakia would not leave the Warsaw Pact. Okay, so he knew that a lot of these other changes he was making were making the Soviet leadership very nervous. He knew they were unpopular with a lot of other corrupt communist governments in Eastern Europe. So to make sure that they didn't feel so threatened by his changes, he promised that Czechoslovakia would not leave the Warsaw Pact. Okay. And just a quick reminder, so the Warsaw Pact, if you remember, at the end of World War II, as Eastern and Western Europe became divided between areas of American and Soviet influence, in 1949, you have NATO set up, so the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. So that was the military alliance of America and its Western European allies, so all the countries there in blue. In 1955, the Soviet equivalent of NATO that is set up is the Warsaw Pact. Okay, so made up of the Soviet Union and all of its Eastern European satellite states. Okay, so here you can see the emblem of it, and you can see the flags of the different members of the Warsaw Pact, such as Poland and Eastern Germany. Okay, now the Warsaw Pact countries, many of them were not very comfortable with Dubček's reforms, and they actually found them quite threatening. Now, why was that? Okay, now the new leader of the Soviet Union by 1968 is a guy called Leonid Brezhnev. Okay, so Brezhnev, you need to remember that name and the spelling. Okay, now Brezhnev had replaced Khrushchev as leader of the Soviet Union in 1964, and he was seen as a much more hardline leader than Khrushchev had been. So Brezhnev was much more hardline. He'd come up under Stalin, as well as working with Khrushchev previously. Brezhnev was seen as a much more hardline communist leader than Khrushchev was, who was, you know, who had flaws but was seen as a reforming leader, at least in comparison to Brezhnev. Okay, now why did Brezhnev and these other Warsaw Pact governments fear what Dubček was doing in Czechoslovakia? Now, the thing to remember is that in countries like Poland, Hungary, East Germany, many of the criticisms that the Prague Spring reformers were making of communism were as true there. So in East Germany, there was a very large secret police, there was a lot of government corruption, there was a lot of censorship of the media. And what these surrounding country governments, these other Warsaw Pact governments, were worried about was that Czechoslovakia's reforms and changes might lead to demands from their own country citizens for similar sort of changes. So they were worried that Czechoslovakia's reforms might inspire protests and demands for change in their own countries. So they were almost fearing a sort of domino effect, which we talked about that idea before. So they were worried that if Czechoslovakia was allowed to reform communism in this way, it might actually lead to protests and demands in their own countries that could threaten their control of the country. So for a lot of those communist leaders, they found what Dubček and the Czechoslovakians they were doing very threatening, because it was potentially a real threat to the kind of power they currently had, and they didn't want Dubček's government to inspire change in their own countries. Now, as the sort of months went on, so he comes to power in January 1968. Dubček's reforms start to go further. So in May 1968, 5 months into the Prague Spring, all remaining censorship of the media is removed, to the point actually that some people from surrounding satellite states like Eastern Germany and Poland were actually moving to Czechoslovakia to broadcast freely back into their own country. So all censorship of the media is removed in May 1968. And Dubček also announces plans to allow free travel to Western countries. Now, that made a lot of the other Warsaw Pact government leaders very nervous, because for a number of reasons. One, obviously, if people were allowed to freely travel to Western countries, they might, as had been the case in Germany in the 1950s, if they were allowed to travel freely to the West, they might travel there and not come back. So there might be a problem of people trying to escape communist rule by moving to the West. But even if that weren't true, obviously, if people can move to Western countries where there is freedom of expression and thought and stuff, people might start to read ideas that the communist government did not want them reading. Okay, so Dubček's plan to introduce free travel to Western countries caused a lot of anxiety amongst these leaders. Okay. Now, what happens then is, in response, 1 month later, the Warsaw Pact militaries carry out these military exercises on Czechoslovakia's border. Now, military exercises were a normal thing for the Warsaw Pact and NATO. So the idea is they would carry out these exercises to practice what would our armies do in the event of an invasion, and so on and so forth. But this exercise was deliberately carried out on Czechoslovakia's borders, and it was done very, very clearly as a kind of warning to Dubček that, you've gone too far, and it was a reminder that if we really wanted to, we could very easily invade Czechoslovakia to force you to stop these changes. So they tried to intimidate Dubček's government by carrying out these military maneuvers. Okay. Now, Dubček's government continued to carry out their reforms, so they didn't back down. And then 1 month after that, then you get this very important meeting at Warsaw in July 1968. So remember, the headquarters of the Warsaw Pact, where it had been signed, was in Warsaw, the capital of Poland. And in July 1968, the leaders of the different Warsaw Pact countries meet in Warsaw to mainly discuss the situation in Czechoslovakia. Now, Khrushchev, as you can see here, met Dubček at that meeting and tried to persuade him to reverse his reforms because they were causing instability and they were seen as a threat to other Warsaw Pact countries. But Dubček refused and said, no, we are loyal members of the Warsaw Pact. We're not trying to undermine communism, but we are trying to reform it in a new direction, away from the old model we used to have here. Okay. Now, what then happened at the end of that conference in Warsaw in July 1968 is you get this famous Warsaw Letter. Okay. Now, to simplify it, what did the Warsaw Letter actually state? Okay. It warned that a threat to the communist system in one country was a threat to the system in the rest, and that Warsaw Pact members would intervene to protect themselves if necessary. Okay. So again, this is very much the kind of domino theory idea. So they said, okay, in theory, Czechoslovakia, you have the right to self-determination to carry out communism as you see fit. But actually, if we think what you are doing is potentially going to destabilize and threaten the communist system in our other countries, we have the right to interfere in your country to stop that happening. Okay, so it's a very, very clear threat that if Czechoslovakia does not reverse these reforms, they risk the prospect of invasion by the other Warsaw Pact countries, okay? Which is precisely what then happened in the month afterwards, okay? So on the 20th of August 1968, Brezhnev decides that enough is enough and that they are going to invade Czechoslovakia to force Dubček's government to reverse these changes which they've been making in the economy and in its political system. Okay, so 500,000 Warsaw Pact countries invade Czechoslovakia. So most of the biggest armies came from Poland, East Germany, Hungary, and the Soviet Union. So 500,000 Warsaw Pact soldiers invade Czechoslovakia. When they invade, Dubček very quickly realizes that the Czechoslovakians have no chance of resisting the invasion, so he orders the army not to fight. 100 people are killed in protests anyway, so as the Soviets march on Prague especially, there were people who tried to put themselves in front of the Soviet tanks to stop them. 100 of them were killed, 500 were wounded, and eventually Dubček's government was overthrown, and a couple of months later replaced by a Czechoslovakian government that was a much more hardline Soviet one. Okay, so Dubček's attempt to create socialism with a human face was then crushed by the Soviet leaders and replaced with the very sort of traditional hardline Soviet model afterwards. Okay, this picture I think is quite an interesting one to look at. So this is when the Soviets were actually in Prague. They'd been told by their leaders and commanders that their invasion was actually something that the Czech people had asked for. So they'd been told by the Soviet government, communism is at risk in Czechoslovakia, and that you are going there to save them from an evil government led by Dubček trying to undermine communism, and they thought they were going to be greeted as heroes as a result. But when the Soviet soldiers arrived in Prague, you had all these people who were peaceful protesters who were saying, you know, what are you doing? Like, we're also socialists and communists as well. We're just trying to reform it in a better direction. So a lot of the Soviet soldiers were very confused when they arrived that all these people arrived and said, you know, you're traitors. What are you doing here? The Soviets are meant to be our allies. You're invading us just like the Germans did in 1939. So that was a very sort of surreal scene. You know, you have these Soviet soldiers arriving, thinking they're going to be greeted as liberators and heroes, and then all these Czech people begging them and asking them why they're there. Okay, and a lot of people after that really turned against the idea that the Soviet Union could be anything but a source of repression in countries like Czechoslovakia. Now, in terms of then the outcomes of the invasion of Czechoslovakia, like what happened afterwards. And the first thing about the US response. Now, at the time, the US was much more distracted by the war in Vietnam. So in 1968, the war in Vietnam was reaching the peak of its kind of violence, and actually the Americans weren't too interested in what was happening in the Eastern Satellite States. You know, Lyndon Johnson, the president at the time, he cancelled a visit to the Soviet Union, but beyond that, there was very little action. And just like in 1956, it was because what had happened in Czechoslovakia was within the Soviet Union sphere of influence. So whilst objecting to what the Soviets did, they weren't ever going to fight a war over what was happening in one of the Soviets and satellite states. Remember, the whole point about the Truman Doctrine was about containing communism to Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, but as long as it was there, they weren't going to intervene militarily to interfere with what they were doing. Okay. The bigger response to Czechoslovakia, the invasion of Czechoslovakia by the Soviet Union, actually comes from the communist world. Okay. Now, the first thing is that the two most important leaders of communist countries outside of the Soviet Union sphere of influence, the leader of China, Chairman Mao, and General Tito, the leader of Yugoslavia, they strongly condemned the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia, and they accused the Soviets of imperialism, okay, so of treating the Eastern Satellite States as their colonies, essentially. So they very strongly condemned the invasion. The other thing was that in many Western countries like, you know, Britain or Italy or France, there were very big communist parties, particularly in France. And most of those people in those Western societies who were in the Communist Party, they really strongly supported the Prague Spring. They thought that the socialism with a human face Dubček was promising was really inspiring. They thought, well, this is a great sign that, okay, the Soviet Union's got its problems, but this shows that they can reform and change in a better direction. Now, when the Soviets invaded Czechoslovakia, though, many of them gave up on communism, at least as represented by the Soviet Union, because they thought, well, this proves that the Soviet Union is unreformable, okay? That actually it is led by people who will not allow these changes to take place because they see them as a threat to their power, okay? So this condemnation of the Soviet invasion from communist states like Chairman Mao's China and Tito's Yugoslavia, but also Western communists living in places like France, they turned against the Soviet Union very strongly after 1968. So the ones who hadn't been turned away in 1956 were largely driven away by the Soviet Union's actions in 1968. They couldn't support the Soviet Union after that. Final key outcome as well is that you get the announcement by Brezhnev a couple of months after the invasion of Czechoslovakia of something that becomes known as the Brezhnev Doctrine. Okay, remember, doctrine is just a policy or set of ideas. So remember, we saw the Truman Doctrine was President Truman's ideas about America's need to contain the spread of communism by force if necessary. Okay, so Brezhnev's doctrine was his policy, and in the case of the Brezhnev doctrine, it was aimed at what the Soviet Union's responsibilities in Eastern Europe were. Okay, now the key part of the Brezhnev doctrine is this part in the speech he does. So this is 2 months after the invasion of Czechoslovakia. So he said, when forces that are hostile to socialism try to turn the development of some socialist country towards capitalism, it becomes not only a problem of the country concerned, but a common problem and concern of all socialist countries. Now, what is he basically saying there? Okay. Now, what the Brezhnev Doctrine essentially stated was that the USSR was determined to keep Soviet-style communist governments in place, and that it would intervene militarily to stop these governments being overthrown, either by invaders like the United States and Britain, or even by rebels within their own societies. Okay, so the point about the Brezhnev Doctrine in a nutshell was that attempts to overthrow Soviet-style governments in any of its satellite states would be met by military repression and overthrow. So, even in the cases like Czechoslovakia, where Dubček said, look, we're not trying to overthrow communism, we're just trying to change it. It basically meant the Soviet Union reserved the right to invade other satellite states to make sure that the version of communist government in power was the one they wanted. So it was a very, very repressive policy, and it was one of the reasons why there were no major uprisings in the Eastern satellite states until the end of the Cold War, because people thought, well, after Hungary in 1956 and after the Prague Spring in 1968, if we try and either overthrow or change communism, we're just going to be invaded by the Soviet Union, and basically be. Okay, so the Brezhnev Doctrine was him stating that they reserved the right to invade satellite states where they felt that the communist system was under threat. Okay, so guys, what I'd like you to do now is you've got a few questions here. So you've got these ones are on the sort of background of the causes of the Prague Spring and the actual events during it. So these first ones are from pages 80 to 83. These ones 1 to 6 are on the first double page 80 to 81. 7 to 11 are on 82 to 83. So make sure you've got those answered in full sentences in your book. So you might want to just pause there and look at those. And once you've done that, I'd also like you to go on to just 84 to 87. Don't need to take as many from these ones. These are questions just about the outcomes of the invasion. So what the response was in the communist world, what the response of the West was, and then a little bit about the Brezhnev Doctrine and the impacts of that. Okay, so make sure that you've got that finished. Take a picture of your notes and the questions once it's done, and just send it to me either on Show My Homework or via email. Okay, all right, good stuff, year 10. Make sure to get that done.